Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Jenny Jones, Dean of the Whitney M. Young Jr. School of Social Work at Clark Atlanta University. Welcome to this interdisciplinary conversation on equity, access, and opportunity, why Black Lives Matter. This event is part of the school's centennial anniversary celebration. The School of Social Work, established in 1920, turned 100 years old October the 4th, 2020. The school was established to educate Black social workers to address the needs of Black people. Issues of inequality and access that led to the development of the school continues to exist today. Tonight's conversation will, without a doubt, be an engaging and informative about issues of racial inequality as it relates to state sanctioned violence and racial terror against Blacks, police killings of unarmed Black men, educational disparities, and voter suppression. But before we move forward, let me share a few housekeeping tips. We ask that you place all questions in the chat section of the Zoom bar to be addressed. At this time, I'd like to have our esteemed panelists, a group of scholars and thought leaders, introduce themselves, starting with Dr. McCoy.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see so many faces. My name is Hbcus McCoy, and I am an associate professor and interim associate dean at Jane Addams College of Social Work at University of Illinois, Chicago. And I want to thank Dean Jones for having me as a part of this important celebration. As we all know, that this is certainly a milestone, not only for social work, but for Black social workers. And I think for the field, it's always important to understand the role that we play, and it's often ignored in terms of how we contribute. So I just want to thank her for allowing me to be a part of this and to share my opinions and thoughts about this important topic. So just a little bit about myself. As I indicated, I'm at Jane Addams College of Social Work at University of Illinois, Chicago. And my work has traditionally focused on the intersection of mental health and juvenile delinquency, particularly for African-American boys, and how mental health disorders for young Black men are inaccurately diagnosed and precipitate their involvement into the justice system. And then more recently, my work has extended and focused on the violent victimization experiences of young Black men 18 to 24. We know that that is the population who's most impacted by violence, but we also know that's the population where we have the least academic research and the most misunderstood and misinterpreted research. So those have been the two areas that I've really spent my career on focusing on. And I'll just share that the reason that I did that is I was a clinician for many years. And I would often see young Black men who were getting treatment from white psychiatrists, and I would see that they were being diagnosed with conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, et cetera. And I would look at them and say, that's not what the problem is. You know, the problem is that they may have major depression, there are other family issues, et cetera. And so that really led me to go back to school and to focus on that area. And that was when I realized that it was not really an area focused on by many African Americans. So I felt extra committed to wanting to do that work. And then finally, most recently, my work, as we've all been living home the last year plus, and we've, as Black people know, racism has been around since the beginning of time in America, and before that, before it landed on the shores here. But as we've all been confronted by the fact that we have so many people who've decided to accept and realize that racism exists, more recently, my work is focused on the experiences of racism for Blacks in America, for particularly Black faculty, and the impact of that on their work and their ability to navigate and function, and how that's intersected with COVID-19. So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy. Dr. Robinson?
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for attending. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces out there. My name's Michael Robinson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Georgia in Athens. I also serve as the director of the MSW admissions program and the director of the Study Away to Northern Ireland program as well. I also hold a position with the Council of Social Work Education. I am the chair of the Commission of Diversity and Social and Economic Justice, and I followed your esteemed Dean Jones, who held that position prior to me. My research interest originally was in depression in African American men. I had a brother, I believe I was 16, who committed suicide. No one knew why. They speculated drugs when there was no drugs in this system. No one knew why he did this. And as I look back, as I matriculated through graduate school, it was depression. My brother was depressed. But again, as Dr. McCoy hinted around, there was no one at that time to diagnose that. I can't say there was no one who could diagnose it. It wasn't diagnosed. And so that led me initially to do research in the area of depression in African American men. Then I'd taken a position at East Carolina University, and I remember a young African American student who I've only seen one time came up to me and asked, what was I doing about police killing of African American men? And I asked him, what do you mean, what am I doing? And his response was just what I thought, and he walked away. And I was very angry, but he was right. What was I doing? And so then I started to focus my research on the killing of African American men by police, and I narrowed it down even more to unarmed killing. I wrote an article, and I think it's probably going to be in the chat or a link for it, where I looked at the killing of unarmed African American men. I just picked 1 year, and at the time that I wrote it in 2016, I looked at 2015. And in that particular year, I found that Black men were being killed by police, unarmed, at a rate of 5 times that of white men and 3 times that of Latinx men. And so now I realize that this gentleman was right. We do have a problem. And so my research has focused on that. So that was the first installment. I'm working on the second installment of that article where I'm looking over a 6-year period from 2015 to 2020. And then I also look at, some of the factors where they running away from the police, that they pose us a threat in any type of way. However, again, I'm only focusing in on unarmed African American men because that seems to be the problem. And so that's what I'm doing, and I'm glad you all are here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Dr. Turner, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Dean Jones, and welcome to our guests. Dean Jones and I are colleagues at Clark Atlanta University. We're fellow deans. I'm dean of the School of Education, and I've been the dean of the School of Education since June of 2018. I'm also an alumnus of Clark Atlanta University. I received my doctorate from Clark Atlanta University many, many years ago. I will not share the year today, but I am a proud alumnus of Clark Atlanta University. It's really an honor to be back to serve as the dean from the school where I completed my doctoral degree. In terms of my professional background, I'm a licensed counselor. I'm a certified school counselor and certified rehabilitation counselor. And so I've worked in the world of professional practice as a practitioner, working with families and children. And my research focus primarily has been recently on the needs of children impacted by homelessness. And so a lot of my work is focused on the needs of children living in foster care and those who have been impacted by homelessness and the intersection of that homelessness with their educational, with educational inequities. And so once again, I'm proud to be here, looking forward to this discussion, and thank you, Dean Jones, for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Turner. And last but not least, Mr. Clifton Crawley, very excited to have him with us tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I'm very honored to be on this very esteemed panel. I don't even know if I deserve to be on this esteemed panel this is. I'm a graduate of CAU, School of Social Work, Whitney M. Young, proud alum, returning back to serve the university that helped me so much through my matriculation, and was able to get me this MSW that I have. I'm not a academic at this time. I'm in the field. I work for the Department of Children and Family Services here in Georgia. I am the therapeutic support specialist for Region 10, and I work for the state of Georgia, as well as I work for Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and both Grady Hospital, and I do clinical work on the side. So I'm all over the place right now. And as you see in the background, I'm on the executive board of the NAACP Atlanta. I'm a founder of the Alliance for Black Lives here in Atlanta, which is we operate across the state, and a member of the Georgia Working Families Party, the Georgia chapter of Working Families Party here in Georgia. So I've been doing a lot of social justice work as well as work in the community. Last year alone, I worked with recidivism, anti-recidivism participant for the NAACP and the city of East Point, where we did some mentor work to help decrease recidivism in the East Point jails. So that's something I'm doing. I'm going to be picking back up in this summer as well. So that's a little bit about myself, and I'm ready to get started.
Thank you, Mr. Crawley. Thank you very much. Again, welcome to our discussion tonight. It's time to dive into the conversation. I am really excited again to have such an esteemed panel of presenters here tonight to really talk about these tough issues that our communities continue to be faced with. My first question will go to Dr. McCoy. Now, Dr. McCoy, you published an article entitled Black Lives Matter, and yes, you are a racist. The parallelism of the 20th and 21st centuries. Please share with us what prompted you to write that article.
Well, thank you. So the story of the article is I serve on the editorial board for Child and Adolescent Social Work, and the editor asked if I would be willing to write an editorial about the experiences of Black men in violence. She knew of my research, and obviously we were sitting at home. I think she asked me maybe in June, so shortly thereafter, after George Floyd's murder. And she thought, based on my research, I might have something to contribute to the conversation, because I had a national study from NIJ that we interviewed young Black men across the country, asking them about their experiences. And so she thought, well, this could be an opportunity to share additional light on what Black men are saying is happening to them. And so I was delighted to have the opportunity. We hadn't yet begun to publish from the article, and I thought this is a time, because the goal of that study was broad, but my personal goal was for people to understand that Black men are experiencing violence, not because they do something wrong, but because they're Black men. And I felt like that's a narrative that never gets told. And so I thought, here's the chance. But what happened was I started writing the article, and I felt like, okay, I've started in the middle. You have to be able to tell the background. And the further back I went, the more I went into history. And I decided, you know, what's really important is that we understand that where we are today, we have been before. And that if we don't acknowledge that, we are bound to repeat it yet again, as we have done multiple times. So as I sat at home and we were 6 months into the pandemic, I thought, everything we're experiencing now, we experienced in the 21st century, but I guess we have the quote unquote fortune to do it over a period of 60 to 70 years and not 6 months. And here we are 6 months in, we've experienced the beginning of a pandemic. We're seeing a recession. We are seeing countless murders of Black people, and we're seeing the increased growth significantly of a civil rights movement. And that was the Black Lives Matter movement. So I wrote and kept writing, and she reached out to see how I was doing. And I said, well, I don't think I wrote what you asked me to, and I think it's too long. And so she said, well, just keep writing, you know, don't cut anything. I said, okay. And I kept writing. And that was where I ended up, was with this article.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, talk to me a little bit about the parallelism of the 20th and 21st centuries. You touched on it a little bit when you were talking about the article.
Well, if we think back in history, so we know we're living in COVID-19, and I'm sure many of us have now heard about the Spanish flu, but there was a pandemic in the early 20th century. and it disproportionately impacted Black people the way it does now. We were treated not very dissimilarly because we were often in segregated housing. We couldn't access healthcare in the same way. And all of that was happening at the same time as World War II was ending, the Great Migration was beginning. And so we as Black people were experiencing significant unemployment, underemployment, healthcare disadvantage. And that was not unlike what we are seeing now during COVID-19. We saw that Black people were fleeing north during the Great Migration, but they were fleeing to a place that they thought was better and wasn't necessarily always better in the way it's expected. We can see based on the current government that we had last year, kind of how Black people were treated, and we see the ongoing increase in people feeling very comfortable to say what they were already doing. We know that there was the Great Depression, and during this COVID-19, we've seen a recession that's disproportionately impacted Black people. And early on in the 20th century was the beginning really of the civil rights movement that came really to a head in the 50s and 60s. And now we have the Black Lives Matter movement, which is considered the largest civil rights movement of our time in this country. And so there are real direct parallels to kind of how we are disproportionately negatively impacted and how we can also find strength to move forward and to gather together to try to affect change.
Okay. When I hear you talk about that history, it takes me back to, again, the development of the Atlanta University School of Social Work, because
Absolutely.
Black people had to be trained as social workers to help take care of us because there was no other place for us to go. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So now you've given us all this history. What do we need to do as social work professionals? Where do we go from here?
Well, it's interesting. I wrote the article for social workers and it's actually gone well beyond that. So I've tweaked my what do we need to do depending on who the audience, but the main things stay the same, is that for white social workers, they need to think about how they contribute to the perpetuation of racism and how just because you decide you're a social worker doesn't let you off the hook. And for Black people, we have to be okay with saying no. It is important that we don't think we need to bear the burden of educating anyone. We have a right to say, find someone else, ask me another time, or I don't feel the need to educate you. We also as social workers have to think about, that as Black social workers, we are not the ones who have power. We might like to think we have power. We don't have that kind of power. Mm-hmm. And so we need to figure out what role we can play in partnering with our communities to be able to have gains, to move forward, but to understand that we do need allies, but we don't have to allow our allies to be comfortable in this. I get frustrated when I hear people talking about, white fragility and anti-racism, et cetera. That's all fine. But if people get to be comfortable when they're having this conversation, we're not doing our job and neither is anyone else. And we need to remember as Black social workers that if someone has to learn about this, that is a real privilege. Because I'm pretty sure every Black person I know, social worker or not, you live it and breathe it every day. You don't get to learn about it. It's a privilege because that means you can put it away and say, oh, I went to a seminar today and I learned something. We don't have to go to seminars. It's in our face. So we have a right to have our feelings, to not excuse and to not let white social workers off the hook.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a great segue into my next question to Dr. Robinson. Dr. McCoy talked about the killing of unarmed Black men. She referenced George Floyd. We know there's been tons, tons of others, not only just Black men, Breonna Taylor. We had Ahmaud Arbery over over in East Georgia, and there's just been more and more and more and more. And your work has really looked at the historical context of this. So tell us a little bit about the work that you've done and how that resonates with some of the things that Dr. McCoy talked about. You're muted.
When I read Dr. McCoy's article, I smiled because she took a historical perspective. And I did that as well because, it's an old adage, you don't know where you're going till you know where you've been. And all of that it's all true. I believe Dr. McCoy went back to the Spanish flu, to start hers. And then she looked at parallels throughout history. And of course, if we don't do anything, it's going to repeat itself. With my article, I went back to 1619 to Point Comfort, Virginia, when the first slave ship docked, and they brought out the precious cargo. And I looked at all of that, and I looked at the laws. I looked at the laws that would develop the slave codes. So I start back the early 1600s, and then I go up to where we are currently, and I look at all the laws that help to contribute to this. I would say it's an epidemic
Mm.
of Black men being killed by police. And so I paralleled history as well. I looked at the migration of Blacks throughout, from moving from the South up into urban areas, and how we began to be over-policed. And so I look at all of that and in hopes of getting a better understanding of what can we do to stem this horrible this pandemic that's going. I mean, it's a dual pandemic now, and Dr. McCoy talks about the dual pandemics of, I guess, social justice, and then I guess the pandemic in terms of what's going on now. But she looked at the Spanish flu, and I think there was another illness that came in there as well, and all the way up into the current pandemic. And so what I found was that if we don't do anything about it in the beginning, we will repeat ourselves. It's getting worse, folks. It's not getting better with the police killings. What's getting better is now you have Black Lives Matter movement that's out there that's helping to bring a lot of this to light. Well, cell phones actually brought it to light, but I mean, the movement is actually doing something about it. I think we're moving in the right direction. What I'm looking at now are policies. What policies were in place then in 1619, all the way up until the current policies of the former president. I don't like saying his name, so I'll just say 45. So now I'm looking at policies, because if we don't understand that, we will never change the trajectory of our young Black men. I was just saying before, I was back in Chicago, and it's not the same city that I left. I go downtown in Atlanta. It's not the same city that it was 10 or 15 years ago. People are activists now, and I love seeing people out in the street. I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and people are still marching there. Almost every week, there is a march for Breonna Taylor. So I think for a long time, we lost our activists. You can remember folks like Jesse Jackson, but then it was a lull. You had maybe Al Sharpton, who was in there every once in a while, but young folks have just dropped off in terms of being activists, and things have gotten out of hand. And I'm glad to see now that more and more young people are being drawn into the movement, which is something that is much needed. We need to train the current leaders today to be leaders tomorrow.
Okay, well, I was just thinking as you were talking, you're a Black man, Dean Turner's a Black man, Mr. Crawley's a Black man, and many of you have young Black men and that you're raising in your homes. What do we say to these kids or these young people to keep them safe when they're out there and have these kind of encounters with the police?
Well, that's a good question. I have 3 stepsons and 1 biological son. And I have a panic of fear when they go out. It's just something inside of me saying, I hope my sons come back. And then they check in with us. It is a horrible feeling. But I do know, and I teach at a predominantly white institution. And when I ask my students, when the police are behind you, what happens? I panic, my heart races, I perspire, and I've not done anything. So I do understand when a young Black male is getting pulled over. I can understand the apprehension, the sudden movements you might make, the urge to run. So I do understand that. It is not a good place to be in, and we need more people like Dr. McCoy who work with young African-American men. We need to know how we ended up here. So we need to know what our rights are. We need to know how to talk respectful to the police, because there's no need in getting upset and angry and mad and end up, in a coffin, as opposed to just getting a ticket or just being arrested and living to fight another day. And so I always tell people, you need to know the history of why we're in this situation we are. It just didn't start, with the gentleman in California who was beat by police. I can't think of his name now.
Whitney King.
It just didn't start there. That was just the first time it was reported. And, to bring it to our attention, it has been going on for a long time. And unless we understand that and understand how we got in a situation, we won't know how to fight it. We won't know how to deal with it. So I always tell my sons, and it's a video out there, and I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called The Talk. It's not about the birds and the bees, but it's a video called The Talk, and it shows Black parents and what they're telling their young sons as they're going through life, going outside to play, going to school, going to the store, and it's what they tell their young sons. And that's what I did with mine. I told them, be respectful. You can memorize an officer's name or the number markings on the car. You don't have to get disrespectful. It's not worth it. Because a lot of those men who ended up dead did not even do that. Someone was selling cigarettes. I won't go through calling names, but something like selling loose cigarettes, that's been going on, since I was a kid. Guys have always sold loose cigarettes. But just knowing that you might not come out of it alive. It's not anything you've done. It's just basically that you're a Black male, and it's all the stereotypes that go along with being a Black male that we have to dispel. And so that's what I basically tell them. It's not anything you might have done. It's because of the color of your skin and that you're a Black male. And there's a lot of fear of Black males out there.
Okay.
And Dean Jones, I have a 15-year-old. And so I've had this conversation with him well before his 15th birthday. We've been talking about this since he was, unfortunately, since he was 6 or 7 years old, talking about the perception that people have of African-American boys. And so we have to have these discussions with them, unfortunately, very early. That they have to protect themselves. And Dr. Robinson, we're not Dr. So-and-so when we get stopped by the police. We're just an African-American male being stopped by the police. And so they don't see our titles. It doesn't matter what kind of car we're driving or what we're wearing. The perception is that we are doing oftentimes something wrong, unfortunately. And so we have to equip our young boys with understanding that and having those courageous conversations. And I too have shown my son The Talk as well. So he understands that he has a responsibility to keep himself safe, no matter if I'm with him or not. So.
Yeah, that's very important, Dean Turner. And I wish we had time to delve deeper into this, because this is quite a conversation, because we see it, we're living it each and every day. I often think about, so when we teach our kids to behave in this way when they get stopped, what about those kids that do behave in this way and they still end up getting shot? And I think that's for another conversation, but we cannot dismiss that because we saw the video of the soldier that was stopped by the police, and he said, I didn't do anything. And they were like, get out of the car. He says, get out of my car. And that became a huge issue. But I think the takeaway message here is things now are recorded when in fact, and they get out to the public, they get out on social media. And there was a time when those things happened, and it was just the police's word against yours. And of course that meant that the police always prevailed during those times. So yeah, thank you so much. I want to turn to you, Dean Turner. When I was listening to Dr. Robinson and Dr. McCoy talk about, the racial violence that have occurred, particularly that we've seen on TV so much lately. And I started to think about that whole pipeline to prison that occurs with kids in the educational system. And I know that you have been involved in the educational system and in many ways, having a son involved and serving as the dean of the school. But I want you to tell us a little bit about, what inequality looks like for children in the education system.
Oh, Dean Jones, that's another conversation that could probably take us all night as well. And unfortunately, COVID-19 really put a lot of the inequities and inequalities really out there, out front for us to see. That oftentimes Black and brown children are attending schools that are under-resourced in so many different ways. The data will illustrate that oftentimes that our Black and brown children are in schools that have teachers that are oftentimes not fully credentialed to be teaching in their respective areas. But oftentimes Black and brown children, unfortunately, are in schools where they're under-resourced in terms of technology. They're under-resourced in terms of arts and athletic programs. And we know that Black and brown children actually thrive when there are arts and athletic programs available to them. They're oftentimes under-resourced also in terms of college preparation programs. But I am proud to say that Clark Atlanta in the School of Education, we've been very intentional about our partnerships and collaboration with especially our neighborhood schools. If you go to most HBCU communities, you'll find that a lot of schools in HBCU communities are under-resourced, which is a horrible narrative, actually, that our schools are in neighborhoods where those schools are under-resourced. But we've been very intentional in the School of Education in terms of our partnerships with our local schools. We have a college, an early college program that we have with the Booker T. Washington High School. We're working with our elementary and middle school students with our summer enrichment programs. We're trying to change that narrative, Dean Jones and colleagues, as it relates to those inequities. We're trying to help to level that playing field so that our children have the same opportunities as other children. We can't do it all, but we do the best that we can within our immediate community. And so I would challenge all HBCUs to be more intentional about the resources and the partnerships that they have with schools in their own communities as well. So that's some of the work that we're doing in the School of Education. It's not
Dean Jones, it's not you, he's frozen.
Oh, okay. I was just fumbling around. Okay. All right. He's frozen. I just want to say, until we get Dean Turner back on, that whole those inequalities and inequities that happen in the school system is really what led me to pursuing social work. Many years ago, and I've shared this story with Mr. Crawley, many years ago, I started out as a special education teacher in a school in a small rural town in South Georgia. And what I was just so stunned when I arrived, because all of these little kids who were poor, lived in rural communities, their parents were uneducated, had been relegated to special education. And they were the brightest, smartest, and you could see the bright light in their eyes when people just took up time with them. So I started to do my own investigation around how did they get here? Why are they here? What is this all about? And learned that not a single one of them, parents, had signed an IEP. They had just been sent to special education. They were poor. They were not as verbal as some of the other kids. And it just really bothered me. So that led me to start looking into policies, and I'm trying to figure out what to do best for those kids, and outreaching to their parents to protest and explaining the law to them, 94-142, so they would know that if you didn't sign this, your kids don't have to be there. And of course, now I'm talking a few decades ago, and I was reprimanded. It really drove me from the public school system to move on to getting a degree in social work, with the goal of trying to eradicate some of that. So I understand clearly what you're speaking about, Dean Turner. I dealt with it myself, and when I think about those kinds of things happening with our kids, what's the likelihood of kids in these communities that you talked about, Dean Turner, moving in, graduate from high school and getting into college? The likelihood is not high if we don't put the types of resources in there. And then we talk about educating them. I want to move to you, Mr. Crawley, because when we talk about kids not being educated and not understanding this whole educational process, how then are we going to be able to help them understand the whole voting process? And I know you were involved last year, greatly involved throughout the state of Georgia with some of the other groups here, registering people to vote, talking to people in the community. You were very active via social media, really working hard in the community to get folks to vote. So tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And before I get started, I wanted to just state that we oftentimes center the violence on our communities towards and against the Black boys, and I recognize that it's a high percentage of Black boys that have been, and Black men are being killed by law enforcement, quote unquote law enforcement. But I mentioned the Ma'Khia Bryants, the Sandra Blands, the Breonna Taylors that exist, that are oftentimes swept under the rug and are on the back burners of the paper because they are women. And the violence against us is not just centered on Black men, it's centered on Black bodies. And women suffer from that same trauma as well. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that. And I try to make sure that I keep myself from just centering Black men, although I am a Black man and I do recognize the trauma that we face, but I also want to extend and understand that and show the empathy for our sisters as well. Getting back towards the original question, yes, I worked extensively with NAACP Atlanta. I actually did a lot of work with Georgia, well, it's called Working Families Party, which is a third political party separate from Democrats and Republicans. The Working Families Party is obviously, with the title, centered on working families. And it's a little bit more progressive, well, a lot more progressive. We don't take any corporate PACs. Some could say we're more of a almost socialist, but I don't consider us a socialist organization. But we do believe in the power of the working families and the working people. So I was actually an organizer for them as well. We were organizers for them and BLM in the communities here in Atlanta and then throughout the state. So I was very much so a witness to not just what we pulled off in 2020, but what happened in 2018 when I saw voter suppression firsthand. And I've never experienced anything like that in my life, to be honest. I've voted since I was 18 and I've never experienced overt voter suppression until 2018 when Stacey Abrams was running for office. And I had to take elderly women from a location in Atlanta all the way across town to another location because their voting districts were redesigned and unbeknownst to them. And when I got there, there were lines of over 3 hours long and on the verge of close because people were down the block trying to vote. That's something that we worked really hard and diligently to get to fight, and we accomplished that in 2020. We made sure that, and when I say we, I can give you direct names. Richard Rose, the president of the NAACP Atlanta, came up with a 17-county strategy in which we focused on the counties with the largest Black populations, making sure that those counties increased their voter registration, making sure those counties were given ballots so that they could mail in those ballots before the election, making sure the people in those counties voted early so they wouldn't be waiting in those lines for extensive amounts of time, making sure they checked their voting registrars to make sure they were registered in their proper districts, We've had lawsuits, and one of the lawsuits was in Sparta, Georgia, because they took off 400 people off the voting blocks of Black rural county in middle Georgia. And we fought to make sure that those Black votes were reinstated and they were allowed to vote. We educated Black people across the Black Belt in the southwest corner where Dr. Jones is from, the southwest corner of the state. And these are very rural and oftentimes very overtly oppressed communities, where you go down to Sumter County, when you're down in Dougherty County and Lee County, when you're in Hancock County in middle Georgia, and in Washington County, which is where Sandersville, the birthplace of Elijah Muhammad. These counties didn't go Black for decades and flipped, not just for the presidential election, but flipped even more so for the Senate race, the runoff race. We had one county that went 96% voter turnout for the Senate race. That's how much of the momentum we gained when we pulled this thing off. And I salute, everyone that participated in that, whether it be Fair Fight, whether it be New Georgia Project, whether it be Georgia on the Rise, whether it be Black Votes Matter, whether it be the People's Agenda, and of course the NAACP. Everyone had their hand, and oftentimes some people weren't mentioned. We didn't mention the Masons, the Shriners, the 100 Black Men, the Deltas, the Zetas, the Panhellenic, people that all came together to accomplish this goal. I just hope that now that we got these elected officials in office, they remember who got them there and the sacrifices that we had to make and the challenges that we had to fight. And they put the policies in place that can help these people in these communities. And if not, then we're gonna have an even greater fight on our hand in 2022.
Yeah, I thank you. Thank you very much. I knew you had been very involved in that, but we did make some positive gains. Georgia turned blue in January of 2021. And then now we're faced with this whole voter suppression piece. You talked a little bit about voter suppression back in 2018. Now, as I do, that Georgia passed one of the most restrictive pieces of legislation on voting rights in the history of the state. And I want to read to you this quote. According to the Brookings Institute, in an interview with Senate Minority Leader Gloria Butler, she stated, "We are witnessing right now a massive and unabashed assault on voting rights unlike anything we've ever seen since the Jim Crow era." And so tell us what's going on the ground in this community around that Jim Crow legislation that was passed?
Well, first, the NAACP, Fair Fight, and other groups, the ACLU, suing. They're in the process of lawsuits now. Those lawsuits actually, though, unfortunately, could take years to get to court. So we might miss the window of 2020 if we are just waiting on lawsuits. So now we have to figure out ways around these laws that were passed. And those strategies are still being in development. We're going to use some of the similar strategies we used before. But one of the most egregious parts of this bill is the fact that the state legislature can or will put together like a 4 to 5 member team of oversight in which they can go and supersede the Secretary of State and basically overturn a local election of a county or a city or any municipality and redo an election. This is directly because of what occurred when Fulton County ballots were getting counted, when DeKalb County, when Clayton County. This is a direct assault on counties that are mostly municipalities that are mostly Black and trying to erase their voting power. Again, we see what white supremacy is. This is another way in which they want to keep hold of power and minimize ours because they realize the state of Georgia is changed. Well, somewhat changed. It's always had a strong Black population, but now the Black population is growing. We have other minority groups in the metro area and they're tending to vote along with Democratic lines. And because of that, they're in fear. And even the governor knows that if we do a fair election, they lose across the state. So they're going to put in place as many obstacles and barriers to make sure that they don't lose their grip of power, because the state of Georgia is 30% Black. How many minority contracts are issued out in the state of Georgia to Black businesses? It's less than 1%. So if you make sure that 30% of Black businesses get these state contracts, you have a very much change in the power dynamics and of the state for Black people. That alone is a fear factor for the establishment, right establishment of the state. And that is something that we have to fight for and fight diligently to correct.
Okay. Thank you. I want to go back to Dean Turner, because when I hear you, Mr. Crawley, talk about what needs to happen, and we've got to get people out to vote again, Dean Turner, I think about again the education of these kids in the school system, because we don't teach civic education in the school system any longer. Kids don't get a course in that. What can we do, or what do you think we can do as educators to help start to teach those kids early on and get some information to them early on, the importance of voting and what that means for them?
We got to make voting relevant.
Yes.
We have to make voting relevant to them. When
Yes.
I was,
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr.
when I was
Crawley. Go ahead.
Yeah, when I was in the communities, I led Black Men Vote, which is basically where we would go to the barbershops and educate Black men on the power of voting and what does voting mean. And oftentimes some of those brothers didn't even realize they could vote because they had been arrested and had felonies. And to get them to understand that just because you have a felony, if your debt is paid to society, if you have paid off your probation and all your court costs, then you can re-register to vote and you're legally able to vote. We even went into the jails and the prison systems teaching them that, because oftentimes, because they're poor, they're incarcerated on misdemeanors and they're not felonies. So they could also vote as well while they're incarcerated. In the school system, we can go out and to teach the kids, again, give them real world examples of why voting is relevant. If you don't vote, you strip your power away. But if you do vote, you at least lend to an aspect of trying to gain a political power in policy. So if you care about marijuana laws and how someone can get arrested for a blunt, and that stays on their record for 17 years and they're caught up in the criminal justice system for the rest of their life, then it's time to vote for policies, not people, policies that will lend to them being able to get their voting rights back, being able to get their full citizenships right back, and their records expunged. If you care about for that money that goes into education, money goes into where I'm in and child welfare, then what that monies go from the government ties to you. And there's not an aspect of our life that isn't some way is in some way influenced or by governmental policy. Governmental policy has dictated everything we do, whether to turn the lights, how the water works, drive a car. All of these things are influenced by governmental policies. And that's something that we have to inform our people and let them know. Because oftentimes when I was in the communities, they didn't understand that voting mattered. They thought voting was a joke and that their votes didn't count. And we would have to, and I would give them a very good, talking and understanding and listening, not dictating to the people that I interacted with, why their voice mattered. And oftentimes they only looked at presidential and gubernatorial elections. They didn't understand that your local votes matter just as much. Your county commissioner, even the land surveyor, your tax assessor.
That's why I wanted to go back. Mr. Crawley.
All of these things matter.
Yeah.
And they matter to the average citizen in the community the local elections touch you closer than the national. And getting that information explained to the youth and getting that information explained to the average citizen. I was in the hood a lot, be straight up. I would go into the hood to teach and to educate my brothers and sisters in barbershops in the community about the power of voting. And I think what we can all do is do the same, whether you are a Panhellenic council, whether you're an academic, do you know how little our college students voted? The precinct at Morehouse College was one of the lowest in Atlanta. And when it came to voting.
Wow. Wow.
Try asking and having a conversation with some of the average college students just in the AUC. And it's not a stereotype, it's just a fact, unfortunately, that oftentimes the students didn't vote. So
but that's why Mr. Crawley, I want to go back to, because you are making the point in my head here. They're at the college level and are not engaged in this voting process as much as they should be. I want to go back to, that's why I'm saying it to Dean Turner. I want to go back to Dean Turner. What can we do in the education system, in middle school, because we don't have civics anymore? What can we do to help these kids start learning at that age the importance of voting and what that means for them, so they don't have to wait until they get to 21 and Mr. Crawley is in the community trying to help them understand it at that time?
I would say, Dean Jones, it has to be a broad brush approach, because when we talk about literacy, we can also talk about political literacy, just like we talk about financial literacy. Oftentimes, if families don't understand the importance of voting, they pass that down to their children. And so it has to be a broad brush approach where we're educating the children, but we also have to educate families as well. And that's why I think this conversation is so important, because educators and social workers should be working hand in hand. What we do in the schools impacts the community, and what impacts the community impacts the school. And so I think the issue of political literacy, financial literacy, educational literacy, what are my options? And oftentimes, children can change the dynamic of their family if they're made aware. They bring that information back to their home and educate their parents and their grandparents, et cetera. And so, of course, our schools could do a better job of that as well in terms of civics and government education, et cetera. But our children need exposure. Talking to them in the classroom is one thing, but taking them to the Capitol, taking them to Washington, D.C., allowing them to walk through the White House and through the Capitol and see government in action, those are the kinds of things that make a difference in families' lives, actually. And sometimes the parents need the same education as the children. And so I think we have to have a broad brush approach to this. And there's not one solution will fit all. We have different levels of diversity within our communities. And so we have to pay attention to that as well. But I think working collaboratively, we can make a difference. But the political literacy, as well as the financial literacy and educational literacy, all go hand in hand. And unfortunately, once again, and I'm sad to hear that the precinct right here in our own backyard had a low turnout in terms of voter turnout, but our community around Clark Atlanta is dramatically changing as well. Our traditional, as you call it, Mr. Crawley, our hoods are definitely changing dramatically here in Atlanta. And so the community around our university is going to look very, very different in the next 5 to 10 years as well. But it's really important for us to pay attention to what's happening around us politically and help our families to understand that as well. It's not just with the children, it's with the entire family.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Dean Turner, I know that you were a part of the development of this national educational report, Revolutionizing Education for African American Learners, a roadmap to the future. Tell us a little bit about that and how you see that report kind of helping set the path for the things we've talked about tonight.
Sure, I'll do that quickly. I was invited. I forgot to say this when I introduced myself, but I was recently elected president-elect of the Georgia Association for Colleges of Teacher Education. So I was invited by the Dean in Residence, Dr. Leslie Fenwick, with the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, to be a part of a collaborative report with deans from Harvard, from Florida International University, Kansas State, and University of Virginia. And so the report actually focused on and highlighted some of the things that occurred as it relates to COVID-19. COVID-19 actually highlighted some of the disparities that exist as it relates to educating Black and Brown children. And so I was privileged to be a part of that conversation. And this report it has been shared with members of Congress, with the U.S. Department of Education. Just today, Secretary Cardona has made some announcements about some intentional funding to support HBCUs. We know that HBCUs still produce the largest number of African-American educators. We know that HBCUs still produce the largest number of medical doctors and dentists and judges. Almost 80% of the judges in the United States are HBCU graduates. And so with our new vice president and our new president, there's been a renewed emphasis on supporting historically Black colleges and universities. And so I'm just hopeful that those resources will meet the needs of families and children as well. And once again, I think HBCUs are going to have to step it up in terms of our relationship with the school districts that we are housed in. We're going to have to step that up in terms of how we collaborate and partner with our own community schools and school districts.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. This has been a very stimulating conversation. I didn't expect anything less because of the participants. But we now have an opportunity to open it up for questions. We would ask if you would put your question in the chat, and then we will read it out. If you have any, if you don't have questions and any comments you'd like to have verbalized, please feel free to put those in the chat. I think I see one, maybe.
And Dean Jones, my former colleague from Howard University, Dr. Snell is on the call, and I have a former student from Washington, D.C. that's also on the Zoom as well. And so glad to see them.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much for attending. Questions, comments? So were you moved at all by this conversation? Please share with us. I see some comments. Stimulating conversation. Yes, we were moved. Excellent discussion. I'm continuing to get comments, not any questions. Well, I just want to say that as we close this out, I hope that we all walked away or can walk away with some ideas around how we can better work around these issues. I do agree very much. I agree very much with Dean Turner around the schools and the social work and School of Education working together. I think that we can collaborate and partner and do better together than separate. We get a lot of the same children that Dean Turner talked about that comes through the education system are the families that we encounter in this profession of social work. So I see wonderful opportunities to collaborate. I see some questions coming in. Someone asked, are you able to do trainings at the schools? And I guess that's going to be directed, Dean Turner, to you. Are you able to do any trainings at the schools?
Yes, and we are routinely, our faculty and I am routinely invited to schools and school districts to talk about ways that we can partner and support children. There are a lot of programs that oftentimes families are just not aware of that can prevent, some of the learning loss that we're talking about now, that can help students in terms of having a safe place to learn and to have recreational options. And so, of course, I know Dean Jones, you and we're more than willing to come out to a school, talk about how we can partner, or to a school district. I've been in conversation with Dr. Johnny Parham, who's on the call as well, around what we can do with Booker T. Washington High School, which is right here in the Atlanta area, one of the most historic and has a rich history and legacy of producing outstanding graduates. And so some of the things that we did in the past continue to work, Dean Jones. And I think it's up to us to kind of step out there and make that difference. And I'm honored to be on this panel with Dr. Robinson and Mr. Crawley and Dr. McCoy.
Okay.
Dr. Jones, can I say something?
Yes, sir, you may.
I think there's a great opportunity for social work schools to utilize field practicum as a way in which they can go into school districts and teach financial literacy, political literacy, et cetera. I know that, some of the social work organizations oftentimes need a lot of volunteers and need manpower. So, the field practicum, person would want to get in contact with, say, a New Georgia Project or a Fair Fight. I guarantee you they will not be turned away. Just I thought.
And maybe we can put the contact information for, is it Georgia Fair Fight in the chat? Okay.
I can find Fair Fight Georgia.
Fair Fight Georgia, I'm sorry.
The NAACP Atlanta, the NAACP Georgia.
Okay.
It's a host of grassroots organizations that are doing the work in the field when it comes to political activism.
Okay. Someone put in the chat when they asked about training, they wanted to know about training around financial literacy and political literacy. If you contact the School of Social Work, we can work with you on the financial literacy piece. And I know Dean Turner can work with you on when we're talking about educational policies, we can do some training for you there. So please contact us at the Whitney M. Young Junior School of Social Work and the School of Education, and we'll be able to get with you around that training. And I just want to acknowledge Dr. Johnny Parham, an Atlanta University graduate. We're so glad to have you with us tonight. So pleased to see you.
And Dean Jones, Dr. McCoy, she hasn't said this out loud, but her mom is a BTW alum as well.
Absolutely. We just, you see, they never leave us. Absolutely. I see another question. I understand the external factors related to the issues discussed, but what messaging can we convey to address internal factors among our people? How do we get individuals to change their behavior in our community? That's a big question. Well, I'll start and then the rest of you guys can jump in. I think behavior change is a process. You don't just go in and wave a magic wand and people change their behavior. You have to first start, I think, by educating people, engaging them in a dialogue around what the issues are. I think a lot of times when we go into communities to help them change, we go in with our agenda around what change needs to look like. And one thing I've learned in the number of years that I've been in this business, you really have to invite people in and let them tell you what's important for them and what they want to work on. Once you start there, you have a better opportunity to move them into your agenda. But I think that's the biggest thing that we do. I've seen it so much in this business that, in social work, we plan what is the plan we put together? We put together the whole plan before we leave the office, and we go out to the families and we say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And we want you to sign right here. That's not going to give us the kind of change that you're talking about, relevant, sustaining change that we all know that's needed in order to help our community. So, I think, again, we just, as Dean Turner has said, we got to be more intentional about this. We got to think this through. We have to bring the community into what we do. We cannot be an isolated entity in the university. And, I think all of you who are in the university have heard this term, ivory tower. We can't stay in the ivory tower and make decisions about people's lives. We have to engage them or meet them where they are in order to affect any kind of change. Any of the panelists have anything they want to add to that?
I think what I'll say is, when I wrote this article, it ended up in a different place than where I started, which is what I said originally. And it's given me the opportunity to share that work with lots of nuances to lots of different groups, from medical students, sociology students, a social sorority on our campus that sought me out. And I think if anyone on the call has an inkling that they want to do something, to just do it, because you never know who you'll reach and the impact that you'll have. I've been pleasantly surprised when I get positive feedback about the article. I really was just writing what was in my heart and what I was thinking and what I wanted people to know. It hadn't really occurred to me about the small, maybe, but potential impact it would have. So I would say that probably if you're thinking it, someone else is too, and to go ahead and share and to do that work, because you don't know what small piece of this larger pie you might share in terms of effecting change. And as social workers, right, that's what we're supposed to all be about, is trying to affect change.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I would add also, Dean Jones, that our young people are doing phenomenal work in the community. I'm just looking at Mr. Crawley, and I think he's relatively young. I think he's in his 20s, I believe, at least, or close to his 20s. But he's doing some phenomenal work, and he's young. And so I'm just impressed with these young people and the work that they're doing, and they're advocating for themselves and for their communities. And so I think we need to promote that more and support them, intentionally as well. Just really support and nurture our young people. I mean, we have to have all of our ancestors worked so hard to get us where we are now, and we have to support our young people so they can carry that torch as well.
Mm-hmm. I think Dr. Robinson, it was Dr. Robinson that mentioned this activism with young people being more involved. Was that you or Dr. McCoy? Yeah.
I do think that, and as Dean Turner stated, Mr. Crawley, he's an example of that. I mean, if you look out at the protests, the people who are out there are all young folks.
Mm-hmm.
They marched down through Lawrenceville as a peaceful protest, and they were all young. I walked down there, and it was like I was the grandfather in the crowd. So the young people are stepping up. But there was a whole generation, and it's my generation, that nothing happened. As I said, you had some of the people like Al Sharpton that were around, and then it just dropped off for years. There was no one out fighting or doing anything. Mm-hmm. And now with these unjust killings by police officers and now by citizens, you got young people who are involved. And I think even with the pandemic, I think even if a lot of the young folks were out there touting getting vaccinated, more young people would get vaccinated. Mm-hmm. They're not listening to the medical experts, but they'll listen to someone else who's in their age range talking about let's do this, let's everyone get vaccinated. So I do think it's important that a whole generation has passed and nothing has happened. It's picked up, the baton was picked up by this generation. Now I'm very proud.
Okay, all right, thank you. Someone also put in the chat, what about having students doing volunteer work at some of the alum entrepreneurial businesses? Anybody want to tackle that?
I think that's a wonderful idea. Once again, that exposure is so important. We talk about the hard skills that young people have to have, but they also have to have those soft skills in terms of their disposition and how to carry themselves once they're in a professional environment, and what better way than for our alums to kind of take that on as an opportunity to mentor, younger students, be it undergraduate students or even high school students. And so I know in the School of Education, once again, we do try to make sure that we mentor our young people and provide them with opportunities, and also highlight them, put them up front and let them present and talk. And so once again, Dean Jones, I'm glad that you invited a younger person to be a part of this panel as well. But we probably should do more of that and really let our students, and so we have some phenomenal students, I know, at all of our universities, but we have to also, nurture that and let them also tell us what they need and how they see things as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Dean Turner. And in terms of volunteer time, I mean, our students do, as well as yours, participate in internships where they have an opportunity to learn hands-on learning around the profession of social work, hands-on learning around education. So that's very important. I just cannot stress enough the need to have these programs. Well, really, the need to have these HBCUs that are helping to educate and graduate these students. That doesn't mean that the PWIs don't educate well African Americans, but HBCUs have kind of been PWIs have been way out ahead of us for many years. So it makes me feel so proud when I think about the work, excuse me, of the various HBCUs, particularly our school. I started this conversation off talking about this school, the Whitney M. Young Junior School of Social Work, started 100 years ago, and thinking about what it took to get a school up and running 100 years ago by Black people for Black people, and the school has sustained itself for all those years. And it hasn't been easy, but we're still here. We haven't gone away. And so I just think about, when I think about that kind of activism for, while it was educational, it was still some activism that got us to where we are. When I think about that kind of activism, that's the kind of intentionality that we have to have today in order for our kids to move to the point that we're talking about. And that's the kind of commitment we have to make, each of us on this call, we have to make in order to move our kids to this place that we're talking about, we want to see them go. And so all of this is just so important, and this is a great conversation. And I knew when I had the initial conversation with you guys about pulling this together, that it would be a very strong conversation, but it would be one that people could walk away really understanding where we are in this country as Black people around these particular issues. It's been very clear tonight that this is not new. This is the reality of the lives that we're living right now. And hopefully we can walk away with some ideas around what we can do, each one of us can do, that's on this call, that's on this Zoom, when we leave here, what we can do to help make some change. Mr. Crawley, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'm like in the classroom. I want to say that I'm not a proponent of ageism. Whether young, 8 to 80, if you got the ability, a sound mind, and you can walk, you can come out and you can be of service. We need all your voices, particularly the people in the academies. You got oftentimes on great panels and you have great conversation, but we need those voices in the streets. We need to see your faces. We need to hear your voices, the knowledge that you have, the history that you have. Oftentimes you don't have the direction. And sometimes we need those voices. We need those clear, that knowledge, that historical sense of what is it that's taking place and the history of what you've seen before. Because oftentimes we're making the same mistakes that we have had in the past. And maybe you have the foresight to say, don't go down this road, go down this road, because this is a clearer road So we need you guys, everyone, not just saying you guys in particular, but we need academics, we need professionals, we need 80, we need 18. Everyone, please, all hands on deck, because this is a fight that's affecting all of us and your generation, the generations in the past, and the generations to come. So I just wanted to say that, just to make sure that it's not just the young. We need you guys too, and we need that energy. The president of the NAACP Atlanta is in his late 70s. He was on the ground when the Wendy's burned down. He was there. So it's not to say you can't do it. We all can do it. It's nothing that's stopping us. But please, I implore everyone to get involved. If you can, let's do it.
All right.
We do have some questions. There was one, Dane Jones, by Claude Elliott. If you could go back up to that one.
Okay.
And Claude wanted some examples of some partnerships that we were talking about. I'm assuming filled with, yes.
Yes. You want to share you have some ideas about that?
What we're doing in Athens is kind of different because it's not in the city, it's not in the inner city, so our students are kind of stretched out. But I think in terms of if Mr. Elliott was talking about in terms of voting, in terms of training students, that's what I was trying to get an understanding of. What do you mean by examples of partnerships? Partnerships.
Okay. Maybe she will respond in the chat to that.
And Sam Burston had something.
Yeah, we talked. I was able to respond to him. He said, "Thanks for the response." Okay. Someone has their hand up, and I can't see the name.
Bonaventure.
Bonaventure, please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, I am new here, so I just want to know what you guys are talking about, because I don't know what you guys are really talking about. So I'm just new here.
Okay.
You just joined the conversation.
Did you just join in on the conversation? Or are you just signing on? I'm not sure if he is muted. He is.
Dean Jones, check your chat.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up tonight. As we close out this panel, I want to allow each one of the panelists to have some parting words for us. Again, as we talked tonight, we've shared a lot of information, kind of why do Black lives matter? That's the question I'd like to have you kind of pose to you as we close out. That was a part of our title. So kind of give us some parting words around why Black lives matter. Who wants to start? Dr. Robinson?
Yes, I would just say that look at the new voting laws that are being passed in Georgia. That tells you that we matter. These laws were all there to restrict us.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we allow that to hold us back, then we're no better than what happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago. But if we get out and vote, they can't stop that. If we need IDs, we need to start getting them now. We need to do what we have to do so that in 2 years, when the midterms come, we're all at the polls again. So
Mm-hmm.
I just think that we matter at this point. We're the ones who turned Georgia blue. And so Black lives do matter, and we need to be here for the future. We need to be here to set examples for our kids. And now is the time to show our kids. It's very important that you get out there and vote. I've heard people in my own family, young people in my family saying, well, my vote don't count. And so and I always say, if everyone says that, we won't get anywhere. So I think now's the time, while the iron is hot, that we're fighting this, is the time to start training young folks on, hey, you need to get an ID, you need to do what you have to do so that when the midterms come, we can all go to the polls and vote again. So my parting words is, let's bring 2 people to the polls with you.
Okay, thank you. Dean Turner?
Oh, there's so many different things that we talked about tonight. We probably could come back and kind of revisit almost each one. But I would say pay attention to what's happening. Just this week, there have been a lot of discussions around teaching critical race theory in schools. So pay attention to what's happening. Think about our children as we talk about developing these programs and developing educational policy, and who we elect really does matter as it relates to distribution of resources, distribution in terms of technology access, because that is what's driving the future. And so, and also I think it's important for us to reach back and help the least of us as well. And that's always been our mission at Clark Atlanta University. It's always been our social justice mission to help the least of those. And so I think, Dr. Jones, we as deans, we have a huge responsibility in terms of our role in leading the man in that regard. And I look forward to continued partnership with you. Dean Jones has walked with me since the day I started on June 2018, and I look forward to us continuing to work together, our 2 schools partnering together. So thank you.
Yes, she is the lucky one, Dean Turner. We missed you at Harvard University.
Yes, I am.
Best wishes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Snell. Mr. Crawley, parting words?
I guess Black Lives Matter because we're human beings. We're all humans. We breathe the same air. We love, we have feelings, we have emotions, we have passions. I don't need a hashtag or a catchy slogan to understand that my life and the lives of Black people across the diaspora matter. We all matter. I think that one of the things that I want to just express is that we're in this fight together. So let's all get involved and let's make it happen for us now and for future generations, to where we won't have to keep dealing with this madness, and we can have, we all can get free. And if one of us isn't free, then we're not all free. So let's get it, let's move forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Crawley. Dr. McCoy?
Well, Mr. Crawley took what I wanted to say, so I had to quickly come up with something else. I mean, I would say exactly what he said. And then to top that off, I guess, and to say that, if we ever needed to wonder if our lives matter, all we needed to think about is the fact that people keep trying to make them not matter, right? They keep trying to kill us, take away our voting rights, take away everything they can from us. And so clearly we matter. And we know that. We have the power to remind others of that. And we should never question that fact. So we need to remember our own power. And if we do that, we'll understand that Black Lives Matter no matter what.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'll just close by saying, I echo everything that you all said. My commitment in this work is to make a difference. And that's what I committed to years ago when I started out. And I like to believe that I have made a difference in the various venues that I have been a part of. And I'll end with one of my, one of my favorite quotes by Mr. Young, because it just always make me think about the work that I do and what I actually what I believe I represent in doing this work. I'm not anxious to be the loudest voice or the most popular, but I would like to think that at a critical moment, I was an effective voice of the voiceless and an effective hope of the hopeless. Thank you all very much for attending. I think this has been a great discussion. We will look forward to many more of these. And I'll say good night. Well, before I say good night, let me just acknowledge another one of our distinguished alums, Dr. Cheryl Dozier has joined us. And Dr. Dozier, I don't know if you have any parting words you'd like to share. My sister. You're muted.
Good evening, everyone. Don't want to hold you up. I had another earlier Zoom, so I came on as soon as I could. But to hear your closing remarks, we have a lot of work to do. And we have a lot of young people ready to do it. And I'm ready to follow, walk with them, walk beside them, and lead when I need to lead. So thank you. This has been a wonderful opportunity. And it's good to see each and every one of you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. All right. Good night, everybody.
Night, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night.